So I'll just kind of start to give everybody a little bit of background about my story and sort of how I came to, my own path of research around women mycology. So I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and I had been in the city for a few years, and I didn't really have a whole lot of connection to land or to plants or fungi. And it was something that I was increasingly realizing was a connection that I really needed to have in my life. I didn't really know exactly what the pathway was to that at the time. And actually it was through a friend of mine. It was just something as simple as an article. He put an article on my desk and he's like, you gotta check this out. And it was actually an article by Paul Stamets, who was talking about the use of mushrooms to remediate polluted landscapes. And it was just like, so many things. There was just something about that in particular, just really popped out in my mind. It's just a really incredible thing. It's like mushrooms used to remediate polluted landscapes. What's that about? And then it's sort of looking into that deeper, I realized I didn't really know a whole lot about mushrooms at all. Beyond, what I was aware of at the grocery store or on the pizza. There was sort of realized that there was this organism at the center of the ecosystem I just knew absolutely nothing about. So just kind of starting to dive into that a little bit more, I just became quickly just pretty obsessed. I just tried to get my hands on any articles that I could, tried to listen to videos and read books, and the more that I started to learn about fungi, the more I started to realize that they were absolutely everywhere. I would come up to the country on the weekends when I could, and I would go out into the forests, and before I even knew the names of anything, I was just learning how to see them. And just that in itself was a transformative experience for me, being able to really see the presence of something that was ubiquitous that I just knew absolutely nothing about. So, I'd go back to the city, and I was living in Bed-Stuy at the time, and I started to see fungi in my neighborhood, just in the city, growing in a little patch of dirt on the sidewalk, or just on a lawn, outside some the projects. And I started to, in that first year, just within, a 5-minute walk from my apartment to the subway, I identified over 7 different species just growing right on my daily walk. So just moments like that of realizing that nature wasn't just out there in this sort of untouched place, but really right at my doorstep, was just only a matter of learning how to see it. And so as I became deeper into my own story of fungi, I began to cultivate. First, just a little bit in my apartment, and then, coming up here to the country, I work on a farm with a partner of mine, and we had all of these old abandoned barns, and I realized this is just the perfect place to start growing mushrooms. And so I moved into some of those barns, and I started a lab, and I just, in my first year, I just didn't even really know where to start, but I just knew I wanted to grow a lot of spawn. So in my first year, I built the lab, I built a pasteurizer and a fruiting room, and just kind of went all in, and cultivated hundreds of bags of mycelium my first year, and just really, for the first time, was one of those things that when, it was the first time I had really found myself called to something that really did feel greater than myself. And I feel that call of fungi is a story that I hear reflected over and over in people's lives. So through this first year, so it sort of went from foraging to cultivating, and then in that first year I met Olga, who is one of the organizers of this conference, and she rolled up on the farm and took a look around, and she's like, wow, this is a really beautiful property. We should host the RMC here. I'm like, totally. What's the RMC? So, then that led to so many profound relationships with just wonderful people through organizing and through posting on the land, and just really for the first time connected me not only just to my own passion, but to a community of like-minded people who were just really passionate about fungi in so many different ways. And so around this time, I came across an article about this woman, and her name was Mary Banning. And I'll get into her history a little bit later in this talk, but it was interesting because I read the story of her life, and she was this amazing amateur mycologist in the 19th century who had just poured her life's work into creating a manuscript of all of the fungi that grew in her local environment. And with these beautiful illustrations and taxonomic descriptions and personal accounts of the ecology over years, it's just amazing work of art. But the interesting thing and not unfamiliar thing about her story is that it was left unpublished at the time, and it's just sat in a drawer for almost a decade, unseen and untouched. And it was, and it took until the 60s for someone to rediscover that manuscript and start to bring her story to life. And the way this article was written was it was interesting. It really focused a lot on the sadness of her story and how, what a shame it was that her work hadn't been brought to light, and how much of a shame it was that she hadn't been represented in contemporary society at the time. And though I found those things really to be a shame and to be really sad, that wasn't the part of the story that I was really initially focused on. I had sent this story to a bunch of other women organizers that I was working with for the RMC and was like, look at this amazing story. And all of the comments that I received back from that story were like, oh my god, like how tragic, how sad, what a shame that she was never published and never known. And it sort of like struck something to me that, even amongst these stories that are starting to come to light, and these stories of these amazing women doing these amazing things, there's sort of this subcontext of the fact that, women have been historically underrepresented, and women have, sort of been lost to time, and so many of these stories aren't accessible. And I kind of felt a calling to start to tease out some of these stories and tease them out to be able to show them to the world and represent them for all of the positive and impactful contributions that they've made. And I think that, in that, I feel like there is also this sort of duty to reshape the way that we think around women's stories, not just historically, but today. And I feel like all of us are really aware of this big shift towards women in science and women in culture and just women at large, and the importance of really shifting this view towards the contributions that are being made and the presence that women do have in society, and the gains that are being made right now. So that was kind of the sort of impetus for me to start, sort of tracing these lines. And so, through this investigation into her story, I started to ask myself the question of what does it mean to be a woman? And what does it mean to be a woman doing this kind of work in the 21st century? And I realized, after asking myself this question repeatedly, I didn't actually have any good answers for it. And it kind of led me to continue to go down the path of really needing to seek stories that reflected women's experience in the way that, I knew that women's experience should be reflected. And so, through this, sorry, does anybody have a little bit of water? Sorry, I'm getting a little... Thank you. So today we're gonna talk about women mainly in science and a little bit in culture, art, and ethnomycology over time. Unfortunately, we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about contemporary female mycologists today, though there are so many, and that would take us another another day to really get into all of the different contributions that are being made right now. But I just want to provide a little bit of a context and a framework for sort of the history of sort of why do we look at mycology as a male-dominated field, how did we get there, how has that education evolved over time, and sort of where does that leave us today, and what can we do moving forward as women and men, participating in the field of mycology. So as I was asking myself this question of what does it mean to be a woman, and what does it mean to be connected to fungi, I was asking the question of have women always been connected to fungi? Is this just something that's been sort of spontaneously emerged in the 21st century, or have we always had those connections? And I was pointed towards a study called Women Care About Local Fungal Knowledge. It was published in 2012, and it covers 16 countries in multiple geographic regions. And so in surveying these different geographical regions, we have regions such as Mexico, Guatemala, Guyana, Nigeria, Zaire, Southeast Asia, Australia, and Russia. Mushroom foraging is largely women's work. So in the spread of who are the people engaging with fungi in these cultures, it's primarily women. And women are involved at every stage of mushroom utilization, from collection to processing and marketing. And these small communities are using fungi for different reasons. So we have income, medicine, food. So these women are really like at the forefront of connecting their communities and their families like to these sources through fungi. And primarily women are the knowledge keepers. So this study is really focusing on what knowledge do women have and what areas in their community are they touching and how are they viewed in their communities as those keeper of fungal knowledge. And so through their participation in fungi, women are, through their wild gathering, they play a role in biodiversity conservation. So they're based on locally available biological resources. So that means taxonomy, that means biology, and that means usage of fungi in their local ecosystem. And so if you think about, all of us are like, all of us love mushrooms, and we all know that mushrooms come up, sort of by surprise. Like we can see them in one place during one period of the year, and the next year we cannot see them again, and we may not see them for another few years, and they're sort of inconsistent and sort of elusive sometimes. And so because of this, instead of the regularity that we have with foraging plants, where we know there's a place we can come back to every season, these women really have to have an understanding of the greater knowledge of the habitat, the niche, the morphology, the ecology of the fungi in order to improve their success of gathering. And so procurement of high-value mushrooms, of mushrooms that are going to be able to be of economic value, are going to be of subsistent value, they're really dependent on this knowledge that the women have been able to steward over generations. And so culinary traditions are part of cultural identity. So these women are not just subsisting for, these women are not just involved, on an economic level with fungi, but they're also the keepers of fungal knowledge, and around their cultural identity, around their culinary identity, and transferring that knowledge over generations as well. And so, information that that's so easy to get lost to time about, like the nature of plants, the nature of fungi, like what they're used for, how they're prepared, where they're found. This is something that has to be passed down and has to be sort of stewarded over time. And this is something that is an integral part of how they're participating in their communities. And so, after reading the study and sort of getting into this and realizing not only are women around the world the keepers of fungal knowledge, and that this is an integral part of the way that they participate in their societies and their local economies and in their homes, I was sort of wondering, being the transmitters of local fungal knowledge, what did this look like before 2012? So that's awesome. We have this study, it tells us a lot about today, but how does this look over history? And so I kind of wanted to get a sense of what's the scope of time? So if we're looking at the first fossil of modern Homo sapiens was found dating approximately 315,000 years ago. Okay, so that's just a point on the map. And so if we look at genetic dating, it suggests that fungi evolved on land in a symbiotic relationship with photosynthesizing bacteria 1.3 billion years ago. Okay, so we have fungi coming onto the scene approximately 1.3 billion years. We have Homo sapiens coming onto the scene, let's say approximately 315,000 years. I mean, that's hundreds of thousands of years before plants. And so we may not know how human beings interacted with fungi throughout time. I mean, that's a lot of years of coverage. But we do know that our ancient ancestors shared an ecosystem, and they grew alongside each other. And so thinking about that evolution, I like to think that maybe, I wonder, are we the transmitters of fungal knowledge, or maybe are the fungi transmitters to us? And I feel like meditating on this fact calls us to listen a little bit more deeply and to choose to sort of step into that doorway and sort of understand what they have to teach us about the herbs and ourselves. So I feel like just sort of the context for this is that, I think as women and as men as well, we all have the responsibility of being sort of called by fungi to understand what that relationship really is, and to explore that. And through this, like, women throughout the world are carrying the torch to create a new generation through reclaiming our inheritance by coming and learning about these stories and understanding our relationship to the women of the past. And so I feel like this is giving us an opportunity to sort of reclaim our inheritance as interpreters of land, protectors of earth, and stewards of natural knowledge, as we're here today to continue that tract. And so kind of like to, throughout this sort of conversation, I kept hearing about how, like, mycology is a male-dominated field. And that's something that comes up a lot. And I just really wanted to understand, like, what does that mean exactly? Like, what does it mean that we're in a male-dominated field right now? I would, go to mushroom conferences and forays and gatherings. I'd see a lot of women around, and, not coming from a scientific background, didn't really have that same kind of context to understand how it meant to be, how it feels being a woman in sciences, trying to make her way as a mycologist today. And so started doing some research, and so this transition to a male-dominated field only in the last few centuries. If you think about it, to go back to that number of 315,000 years, thinking about, like, our relationship to fungi and women's connection, that's a relatively short time. And so to sort of zoom into, like, why this could be, there's a text by Frank M. Dugan called The Conspectus of World Ethnomycology, and it begins to sort of outline this shift. There's sort of two characters he touches on, Carolus Clusius and Franciscus van Stierbeck. Carolus Clusius and Franciscus van Stierbeck were both from the 17th century, 16th and 17th century, and Carolus Clusius published the first treatise on fungi, Fungorum Historia, and this was the first real book to be written about fungi. And in this book, Carolus Clusius is talking about the mushroom in and of itself, so just really, like, isolating the organism one by one and really zooming into just the mushroom as an individual. But it was in that process had sort of removed the cultural and human context from the description. And so I feel like that moment is kind of a clutch moment for, I think, the separation of the cultural and personal connections that were always completely integrated into the history of fungi up until this point. Like, when we kind of look back on thinking about that 2012 study, women and the mushrooms in their communities, the local ecology, the personal ecology, like how people are using them for medicine and for food and for financial subsistence, understanding their ecosystem. This is all interwoven into the story of the mushrooms themselves and the women that participate with them. And so to then make that separation and to be beginning to look at them just simply as organisms without that cultural context, that's one of those first sort of breaks from the sort of cultural lineage that had followed. Then we look at Franciscus van Stierbeck, and he was one of the instigators of that research. So he was out in the marketplaces talking to folk women, and that's where most of the research for his papers was coming from. So, he'd be going to the markets, and there'd be women with their big baskets of mushrooms, and he'd be talking to them about, like, where did they come from, and what do you do with them, and, and all of the different questions around, about their local knowledge about fungi. And so then, and I don't think that either one of these men, I don't know them. I don't want to say, I can't say, like, whether they were good or bad people. I don't know that. And I feel like, anybody with the endeavor of trying to amass information and consolidate information about fungi, like, I can get down on that, but to take that information and sort of rebrand it and decontextualize it from the women of which it came from, whether that was intentional, that's, or inadvertent, that I think was the instigation of the real disservice to women's connection to that fungal knowledge over time. And so, sort of another, pause real quick. So when this moved from being a common knowledge, a shared knowledge, a cultural knowledge, to something that became disconnected from that folk wisdom that sort of everybody had access to, This is one of the milestones of sort of slowly of the sort of the sort of segregation of community and of accessibility for everyone, like from fungal knowledge. This became a situation where, so this was, sorry, just go back on track here. So this shift from women's knowledge to men's knowledge led to a prohibition of traditional practitioners. So this knowledge transfer is sort of slowly happening at a time where many women were being persecuted as witches and killed because of their illicit knowledge. Strikingly, women's knowledge of fungi didn't acquire the status of science until it was collected, systemized, and transmitted by men. And really, just sort of thinking about, and that's like a whole other rabbit hole to get into witch hunts and botanical knowledge and the sort of like breakage of that transmission. And I'm not going to get into that here. But, this sort of question comes up as to, I wonder whether, did women fear for their lives? Did they feel like they could not express or talk about or pass down any of that botanical or fungal knowledge? Did this contribute to a break in the transmission? I feel like, that's a huge part of the story that, again, we don't have time to cover here, but, if under fear of persecution, having, how much of a struggle it must have been to try and carry that forward and keep that, trajectory going. So, sort of moving from the 17th century to the 18th century, the transition to Enlightenment. So we have a time when, the Enlightenment, so the history of women in taxonomic mycology actually begins in the Enlightenment. And so this was well underway in Western Europe by the latter part of the 17th century. And so new ideas and ways of thinking were starting to come into play, like people's shifts about, the way they were thinking about all areas were just making a huge transition. And so one of those fields was botany. And so botany, which included the study of fungi, because at the time, mushrooms weren't seen as distinct from plants; they were seen as the same, or some sort of strange kind of plants. Botany revolutionized by the discovery of plant sexuality, and Linnaeus used it as a basis for a system of classification. So this is really the first time when mushrooms and plants and sort of all classifications of life are starting to be systemized and classified, and this sort of structure of how things are relating is being sort of trying, human beings are trying to wrap their head around this sort of unwieldy natural world of ours and put it into a system that makes sense. And so, there's many positive things about this. So, through the creation of a classification system, this unlocks potential for people to be able to engage in the study of botany in a new way. And be able, in a way, it's almost like a push towards democratization in some way, of being able to provide a way that, anybody sort of independent of, the masters at the time could go out into the field and encounter plants or fungi and use a key to be able to understand what it was. But, unfortunately, during this whole big transition, few attempts to include women were really made to sort of, women's education at the time was just, far lacking behind. So what advances were being made, weren't really that accessible to women at the time. And so, at the time, it's female education was really happening in the home. So this is happening, and primarily, at their best, girls in upper and middle class families may be taught the same lessons as their brothers. But really, they're more likely to be given instruction in, domestic and decorative arts, things that really contributed to raising a family or keeping a good home, or really coincided with morals or the higher sentiments that of the ideas that we had about how women should be participating in the world. And almost without exception at this time, there's really no access to women, for women or even most men at that time to higher education. It was really something that only the elite and people with a lot of money and resources really had access to. And so despite these setbacks, during this time, this was also the beginning rumblings of women's empowerment and feminism. A lot of important writers, Mary Wollstonecraft being one of them, began to be like publishing accounts of women's liberation and women's equality, and providing representations and arguments for why women should be included as equals. With every setback, there are always people that are on the other side, like looking to push those boundaries and to, and this was a time where that was beginning to take hold. Another thing about this time is that, in boys' schools, Greek and Latin, these were the traditional languages of scholarship. So again, there's kind of another barrier, not just, there's another barrier in education of like how these texts are being written, like who can read them and what makes, I'm gonna back up. So like who can read these texts? And so again, botany was especially valued on the basis of traditional associations from myth and literature that linked flowers and gardens with women and nature and femininity and modesty and innocence. So, though there were many levels at the time of like botanical interest and study, women were able to engage, but only insofar as it sort of supported these other ideals that were pushed forward at the time. But though the new systems of binomial nomenclature and classification greatly facilitated the study of botany, those without an understanding of the Greek or Latin, again, were like not really accessible to that higher level of education that was being offered. But despite this, so sort of interestingly enough, so there was one woman during this whole century, Katerina Durian, who is a governess and an author of textbooks for children and women, who was the first person the only person that we have accounts of that was contributing to taxonomy during that whole century. I mean, she coined new plant names. She was the first, and for 50 years, the only female taxonomic mycologist. And so her work was never published, and because of that, her name sort of sort of faded into obscurity. But she still was able to make that mark as the first woman to really be contributing to this field. And fortunately and unfortunately, she was able to do that because of privilege and the status in which she was raised. And that is a common theme that you'll see in a lot of these women, especially through the 18th and 19th century. But as we move into the first half of the 19th century, so then we start to see more developments happening in the field of mycology at large. So a gentleman named Miles Joseph Berkeley coined the term mycology and mycologist in 1836, and the first paid careers in fungal research started to become a reality. At that time, progress remained slow, for women, and only one woman, Marie Anne Lebert, managed to name a new fungal taxon in the first half of the 19th century. And so, at the time, women, so we see again, more, we see, sort of more nods to founding fathers of mycology. Women are sort of slowly, sort of pushing the boundaries, very few amount of women are pushing the boundaries to try and, fight towards female equality. And there are a few women, and just even fewer, as little as 2 names, that are able to make their mark onto the history of mycology from the women's perspective. So women were still educated at home. Increasing numbers of girls benefited from at least some years of primary schooling in the 19th century. So it's getting a little better. Education's starting to kind of get out there. People are learning a little bit more. There was a steady rise in this time in literacy rates, more opportunity for women to educate themselves in natural history, and a growing number of field naturalists in the group. So again, with the introduction of this, binomial classification system, that, literacy is improving, written materials are becoming more ubiquitous. There's this sort of move towards, what we now see is amateurs and naturalists who we know have made, incredible contributions to the field. So this is kind of the seed of where that history is sort of beginning to emerge and take place. But though, while improvements in and But while improvements for amateur mycologists and naturalists are starting to begin to slowly emerge, unfortunately, there's sort of an entrenchment and a hold on higher education and professionals, from which women were, still barred from completely. So, the field of mycology in itself is growing and becoming more of an established science. And, amateur naturalism is the way that women can really make a stand and take hold and start to further that knowledge. At the time, so somebody named John Linley, who's the first professor of botany at the University of London, says that polite botany he defined as an amusement for ladies, from botanical science that he regarded as an occupation for the serious thoughts of man. So you can kind of see from that statement kind of where some of the general sentiments were around women's relationship to botany, and the differences between men and women in that time. And so there's really no opportunity to study natural science at university, and women struggled to disprove the prejudices of people like Linley, and were largely restricted to self-education and unpaid research. And again, this is not just a matter of men versus women, because you have to remember that during that time, there were plenty of advocates that were women against women's literacy. There was a whole movement of women that believed that women needed to stay in the home and needed to traditionally raise children and keep house, and that it was religious and immoral for them to achieve a certain higher education. So it's not really so black and white, and I certainly want to make it clear that this is not a conversation of women versus men, because there's so many different shades of gray around these topics, and frankly so many men over time who have also advocated for women's literacy and the integration of them into the sciences. So I just want to make sure to put that out there, because I feel so often in these conversations it can be easy to kind of demonize and sort of point the finger, and it's really, for me, not about that at all. It's about understanding how we are able to work together to sort of bridge chasms in ideas and idealism, and that takes a lot of time. So to continue on, in this context, Marie Ann Liebert was able to become a taxonomic mycologist due to special circumstances. So similar to Katharina, she grew up in a supportive family. She attended a girls' boarding school for several years and was able to extend her education beyond that of most women of her time. And so one of the contributions that she made to fungal taxonomy was the first new fungal taxon, Asteroma rosea, which was a leaf spot. And she was the first to name a species of late-season potato blight that caused widespread famine in Low Countries in Ireland and England in the middle of the 19th century. And so this, she was one of the foremothers of plant pathology, a field of which so many women would go on to make really powerful contributions in the second half of the 19th century. And we'll get into some of those names here. Kind of another thing too is that so often at these gatherings there's a lot of topics that are covered. We talk about we go foraging for fungi out in the field. We talk about ecology. We're talking about cultivation and edible mushrooms. But there's a whole other realm of plant pathology and personal health and many science fields that don't always get the kind of acknowledgement in these kind of contexts as profoundly influential and supportive they are just to our ability to live and thrive. So I sort of see those areas as maybe not the areas that we focus on or talk as much about just in general, but some of the most important areas to our health and well-being as humans. So just kind of wanted to touch on that. And so kind of that's so moving sort of through to who are some more of the women who continue to push the boundaries. And we're going to start with a woman named Anna Maria Hussey. She was from 1805 to 1853. She's a British mycologist, a writer, an illustrator, a wife, and a mother. And along with her sister Frances Reed, she wrote and illustrated a text called Illustrations of British Mycology. This text had over 140 hand-colored plates, deep detailed description of her personal experiences in the field, traditional uses of fungi, was really bridging the science and the cultural connections between fungi. And so she really like learned from personal experience in the field and really like sought out relationships with prominent mycologists and biologists. And it's sort of interesting, like looking into her story, like and reading a little bit about her and some of her texts. She's a real like pistol of a woman in like the best kind of way, like really bold and really just sort of true to who she was. But the sort of interesting thing enough is that in her writings, there are still, despite all of the contributions that she was able to make, in a time where still there was not a lot of access available to women. There are quotes that are found from her that say, "I'm always under the uncomfortable impression that the thing I'm doing is not the right thing to be doing. And also, I feel sure mycology was never intended for women who love jumping to conclusions better than such patient research." It's kind of interesting, like, I just kind of want to like take a moment and just kind of sit with that. Like, I'm always under the uncomfortable impression that the thing I'm doing is not the right thing to be doing. Now, I wonder, like, I've certainly felt that before, and I don't think I would be I don't think I would be out of line in saying that all of us, men or women, have sort of felt that way at one point or another in our lives. But it's a sort of interesting thing to emerge, looking back on this woman who had such profound contribution and drive in a time where even resources were so little, to still, carry those doubts that were, I think, part of a greater, it was a reflection of where women were in the time at large, not really feeling comfortable pursuing these, greater studies, not really comfortable stepping forward and representing that knowledge. So it was still really a struggle to be able to show up and claim that reality. And that's something that just kind of really stuck out to me. What must she have had to go through to really come out the other side and publish what she did and have the impact that she did, still holding those feelings. Something that just kind of sticks out in my mind. Another woman who I feel like I have a profound connection to, who also kind of reflects that sort of sentiment, is Mary Banning. She was born in 1822 and lived till 1903, and she was born and raised in Maryland. And she was the first woman in the U.S. to develop a regional illustrated account of fungi that we know of. So she illustrated over 174 watercolor plates of fungi, and she identified over 23 new species. Her manuscript includes detailed taxonomy and personal accounts. So again, this is a woman that is out in the fields, I could imagine day after day, going out, recording what she's seeing, going to all of her, to the local parks in the city and to the countryside, and just providing an account year after year after year of local conditions that are shifting over time. And not only just documenting what she's seeing, but documenting just sort of the culture around her at the time as well. Looking into her manuscripts, there's this rich, rich and profound connection to where people were in the time. Baltimore, Maryland in 1840 and through early 1900s. This is the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Cities are exploding, they're crowded, they're bustling, there's people, coming from, all over the world to, settle on the East Coast. And it's sort of interestingly enough, she, looking into her history, she grew up on the seaside, she grew up on the seaside in Maryland, and she writes somewhere in her manuscript that there's no other real account as to how she came to fungi, but she has this one or two sentences reflecting on all of the fond memories that she had going out into the hills above the seaside, encountering fungi. And you don't hear anything else about that until years and years later when she begins her manuscript. But I just have to think if this woman, in this bustling, crowded city, sort of restricted to taking care of her ailing family members, was that not an attempt to get back at something more more foundational, like in her life? Like, what were those formative experiences where she was out engaging with fungi, and how did that come back into play later in her life when she decided to undertake this manuscript? Like, was it a respite from like her caretaking duties? Like, was it an avenue, one of the only avenues she could have at the time? I don't know the answer to that, but there are sort of clues of that you can sort of tease out of her story. And so with her own money, she bought a microscope and she started to amass a scientific library and private herbarium, translated texts from Latin, and submitted articles to scientific journals. So again, incredibly uncommon for a woman of her time. If you sort of remember where we talked about earlier about education and how education provided pathways in order to have higher education. So by the fact that she was born in a family with privilege, that she was able to study Latin, and so she was able to send for texts from Europe and translate these texts when there were really no texts available. I think there was like one text available in North America that was not written in Latin at the time. So those were some of the foundational resources that she was using to like go out into the field and start to identify and make her classifications. She also worked closely with the New York State botanist at the time, Charles Peck, and over a course of 40 years they exchanged letters, having never met in person, letters and specimens, and there's this beautiful sort of record at the New York State Museum of all of the correspondence between them. And they still actually have her specimens that she sent into Peck in the herbarium. So again, she was somebody that was really like going out of her way to rely on all of the newly available resources available at the time through the New York State Museum, and sort of made more accessible to amateur mycologists and naturalists, people that were sort of pursuing this underneath the sort of the mantle of scientific mycology and botany. So, despite pursuing these careers and so just again to sort of touch on her story. So, this was a passion project that she had worked on for basically her entire life. And at the very end of her life, she had really like made every attempt to get this just incredible volume published. And in a minute, I'm going to pass around some of the illustrations so you can kind of get a visual for sort of what these plates look like. But again, for many circumstances, some due to finances, some due to accessibility of women in mycology at the time, she was unable to get the manuscript published. So in sort of like a last-ditch effort, she sends in her volume. It's like this huge tome. I spent a few months really researching this manuscript up at the New York State Museum, which is accessible for anyone. I would highly recommend going and just like looking through their archives. They've got an amazing selection of like endless troves of information. But this huge tome she sends in at that point, and this is like prior to this is like real snail mail. This is like horse and carriage. Like it's taking like a huge journey to get something like that somewhere, huge cost. In the hopes that she could get her manuscript published. And so, unfortunately for certain circumstances, some that we're really not aware of today, the manuscript was unable to be published and sat just sort of unacknowledged and unseen, with the exception of a couple records that are available, for almost a century, until it was rediscovered in the 60s by the New York State botanist at the time. And that was sort of the first sort of re-unveiling of Mary's work to the world. And so, I feel profoundly grateful for everyone that has contributed to like getting her work out there. It's still not published, but the work is being taken care of and available, and so her story is starting to really, slowly get out there. So, I feel grateful to her impulse to send it out before the end of her life. I sort of think to myself, like, if she hadn't made that choice, like, where would her work be today? We probably wouldn't really know anything about her. And how many other women might there be who had manuscripts or, or records of information that they had spent their life contributing to that may have gotten lost to time, or, could still be sitting in a drawer out there somewhere right now? Frankly, just after beginning this project of just sort of following these threads of just, one woman, two women, almost so many people that I talk to, happen to know of a woman who has a box in an archive in somebody's desk. It's all of these stories remain and are sort of waiting to be told. And I just know that, the more that these stories begin to be unearthed and to begin to be circulated, the more that we're going to discover about what contributions women have been making to this field. So, again, despite pursuing these careers from a place of passion, many 19th century women were still plagued with doubt that their work wasn't good enough. They were unsure if they were doing the right thing, and they had to give up their work for various reasons, whether that be familial obligations or financial restrictions or just life circumstances. And so, instead of looking to these women, for some of the sadness in the story, I like to look at these women as examples of the power of courage and passion to overcome obstacles, because there were really so many at the time. So I'm going to just take a moment and pass some slides around. I've got a selection of both a few of Mary Banning's plates here, and another woman who we'll touch on briefly, which is Beatrix Potter. So how many people know of Beatrix Potter? And how many people know, Peter Rabbit? Does anybody grow up reading Peter Rabbit? So how many people knew that Beatrix Potter was actually an amateur mycologist in addition to, so quite a few, which is awesome. So I'll pass some slides around. We've got a few of her illustrations, but in addition to, before her work illustrating children's novels, Beatrix Potter was obsessed with fungi. She illustrated hundreds of plates of fungi, and did some really deep research into the relationship between mushrooms and ecology, and even was working towards submitting scientific papers to the local scientific boards. Unfortunately, due to her position in society, and again, So we don't really know why Beatrix Potter transitioned from mycology to children's illustration. One of those reasons could be the difficulty that all women of her time were facing in really showing up in the scientific establishment. She had really tried to enter into the scientific discourse with prominent mycologists of the time, and really was not able to have her work and her research taken seriously. And there are a lot of texts out there that actually get into Beatrix struggle with this a little bit more deeply, and we're not going to touch on all of that here, but there's a really interesting sort of conversation around Beatrix Potter and what could her aspirations have been? Did she really want to be part of the scientific establishment? Was that a goal of hers, or did she, or was she more of an amateur mycologist that wanted to, focus on field observation and focus on illustration? And there is also a great archive of her work and correspondence. I'm not sure exactly where it lies right now. We can follow up on that afterwards, but luckily she is another example of a woman whose work has been, preserved, and her communications have been preserved as well. So we can kind of piece together that story, though there still are some gaps about what her, what her relationship was towards the scientific establishment of that time. So I'm going to do a little time check here. So we're going to cover a few more people, and kind of foray a little bit away from the art into the science. So another woman who comes up in sort of the women's mycological history is Flora W. Patterson. She was born in 1847 and she lived until 1928. She was the first female plant pathologist to work for USDA. and later became the department mycologist in charge of mycological and pathological collections. So just 2 years before her work at the USDA, she was denied entry to Yale on account of her gender. So again, just like we're still making strides here. It's like women are still, barred from access to most like higher educational institutions. But instead, she went to Radcliffe and received formal mycological training while working at Harvard's Gray Herbarium. So, while some people were still closing their doors, others were beginning to sort of open to some of the shifting perspectives of the time, and just sort of slowly, feminism is starting to sort of take hold and pressure that shift. So during nearly her 3 decades with USDA, she identified many novel fungal infections while also developing a means for successfully eradicating several detrimental blights. So again, we're going to kind of jump back to the foremother of her work, which was Marie Anne Lebert, who sort of opened the doorway for fungal pathology. And here we have Flora W. Patterson, who's picking that work back up, decades later, centuries later. So in Flora W. Patterson's lab, so she also expanded the U.S. National Fungal Collection by over 90,000 specimens. 90,000. That woman was busy. So 3 other female mycologists were hired under her. Her guidance. And again, this I think speaks to the importance of women studying fungal pathogens, both in humans and plants, and really helping us to have better understandings of our physical relationships to fungi in both health and wellness and the food we eat and our bodies, and just really set the stage for that understanding. So another women in the scientific space, and for who out here cultivates fungi? A lot of folks. And how about anybody here use agar-agar? Yep, so definitely. All right, so Fanny Hesse was born in 1850 and 1934. So in 1881, alongside with her husband Walter, she discovered the use of agar-agar as a culture medium, revolutionizing the world of microbiology and making so many things in mycology possible. It's sort of interesting. There's a story about how she came to this discovery. So again, we have a lot of associations in that time about women, as sort of keepers of the hearth and being in kitchens and really familiar with the cooking and the creating of food for family. And so being a woman of her time, she was probably cooking a lot. And so agar-agar at the time was a food product used to create, Jello, or I think it was traditionally just used for Jello. So there's the story of her using this substance for some dessert, and then realizing we should try this in the lab. And it turns out that she presented this sort of offhandedly to her team, her husband, and the biologist she was working with at the time, and they implemented that, and that is that was the impetus for being able to use that as a culture medium. So they worked in that lab for Robert Koch, who is considered the father of microbiology. But Koch claimed that discovery for his own, and it wasn't until recently that Hesse got the credit that she deserved for that contribution. So again, it's sort of exploring the relationship between the fathers and the mothers, and sort of who those people are, and how those lines aren't always clear.
What was her name?
Her name is Fanny Hesse.
Okay.
So, does anybody here work in plant pathology? Anybody familiar with? So, in the Northeast, we had this this fungal blight epidemic called the Dutch elm disease. Is anybody familiar with that? It's like one of the reasons why, walking around these areas, you so infrequently and you see live elms, and very rarely see, not really at all, any mature elms. And so the Dutch elm disease was a fungal disease that sort of wreaked havoc on the elm population here in North America and also in Europe. And the cause of this disease was discovered by a team of 5 female Dutch scientists. And the source of this disease was uncovered in 1921 by a team led by Johanna Westerjik. I don't speak Dutch, so I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but if anybody here speaks Dutch, then maybe they can help me out. But she was the first female professor in the Netherlands. She wrote over 70 papers on mycology and plant diseases and supervised over 55 PhD students, half of whom were women. So, just to sort of think about again, 1921. So here in North America and in Europe and elsewhere, we're still experiencing like this extreme barrier to access to education as women. But here in the Netherlands, we have the first female professor, and we have over half of her students are women at the time. So, again, there's a lot of different, we're sort of focused here in North America because, this is sort of like our ground zero, but, there are sort of different relationships to mycology emerging throughout the world at that time. So,
how do you say her last name, or kind of say it?
It's Westerdijk.
Thank you.
So. Okay, and so sort of a couple more to sort of touch on the topic of public health. So everybody knows that, well, not everybody, but how many people know here about penicillin? Okay, so penicillin was one of the most influential antibiotics that were discovered, and so traditionally, there was one person, Alexander Fleming, who was sort of represented as the discoverer of penicillin. But actually, he was one of many who contributed to this discovery. And in 1943, this woman, Mary Hunt, who was referred to as Moldy Mary, I think affectionately. Moldy Mary. So she was out gathering lunch for the lab that day and out gathering specimens that she could potentially use to cultivate more resistant strains of penicillin. So she found a golden mold growing on an American cantaloupe, brought that back to the lab. A number of experiments took place, and researchers discovered that if Mary's mold was exposed to X-rays, a mutant penicillin strain was produced that further increased the quantity of antibiotic compound to 1,000 times more than Fleming's previous example. So again, at that time, penicillin was discovered and was making, an impact in people's lives, but it did not increase in its level of efficacy until Moldy Mary came with her contribution, and that was added to the fray. So this had such significant impact, which meant that by 1945, more than 1 million people had been treated with the drug, as opposed to less than 1,000 in early 1943. So huge implications here. So last but not least, we have 2 more characters, Elizabeth Hazen and Rachel Fuller Brown. In 1950, discovered niacin as one of the first antifungal drugs. I mean, how ubiquitous those are in our daily lives. You get a little athlete's foot, or fungi are kind of making our way into the body and giving us a little trouble. So we turn to antifungal drugs in order to help address that. And so one of this drug that was developed based on this discovery is used to treat various Candida infections such as diaper rash, yeast infections, and thrush. So again, something both men and women experience, but is been profoundly influenced. The treatment has been profoundly influenced by these 2 women that helped develop this novel antibiotic. And so, kind of want to we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked a lot about, women in science, sort of like the cultural history and sort of political, social history of this over time. But kind of wanted to touch for a minute on the cultural contexts. The stories around the cultural context with fungi are even less often told. Like these, the stories of science are, because they have profound impact on, our food and human health. Like even these are kind of able to take more of a foothold. But sort of how like culture's relationship to fungi over time, different communities, indigenous and otherwise, the stories are sort of less often preserved. And so there's, today there's, just like kind of we talked about earlier with, Franciscus van Stierbeck and Carolus Clusius going to those marketplaces and, gathering the folk knowledge and sort of like repackaging that in a different format. There's still a risk of that today. And so I just kind of wanted to touch on a woman in this next story who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This woman, Maria Sabina. So she's a Mazateca curandera and farmer for southern Mexico, born in 1894 and lived until 1985. And so she was a woman who used psilocybin mushroom ceremonies to heal the sick. And so, all of the consciousness around psychoactive psilocybin mushrooms in North America today, it came from this man, Gordon Watson, traveling to Mexico to meet with her and bring back that knowledge here to North America. And so Gordon Watson was an amateur mycologist and PR person for J.P. Morgan, and he's known as the father of ethnomycology. And so in 1955, he became the first Westerner to encounter Maria Sabina and participate in her mushroom ceremonies. But, he was actually introduced to mushrooms through his wife, Valentina. And so Valentina was a pediatrician, chanced upon and the story is that Valentina, she chanced upon some wild edible mushrooms and brought them back to the house and was cooking them up with Gordon. And he was sort of fascinated by the marked difference in cultural attitudes towards fungi in Russia compared to the United States. And this is what sort of birthed his lifelong fascination with fungi and led to the publication of Mushrooms, Russia and History in 1957. So in 1957, a publication comes out in North America in Time Life magazine called Seeking the Magic Mushrooms, an article. And this is really the first time that awareness of psychoactive fungi is brought to North America in the 50s. So when you think about the 50s, you just sort of think about the Formica countertops and the pink kitchen and sort of just sort of the 50s sort of conservative lifestyle. And then suddenly people are getting these magazines showing up at the doorstep talking about ritual mushroom ceremonies in the thick of Mexico. So you can kind of imagine, and we all know kind of what that led to. And so, after this exposure, foreigners flooded into Mexico to partake in her ceremonies. And so, Maria Sabina, luckily, due to her, to what became her, sort of what was the word? Sort of her fame, due to her fame, which I don't think was necessarily something that was fully requested by her. Often the younger foreigners who came, did not know the proper way to respect the medicine, and she writes about this. Or there were interviews with her that were seeking for her to tell her stories. So, thankfully, her voice and her account of the events that followed was able to be documented and represented in her own words. And so, others like Gordon Watson, continued to profit from her story. And, again, this is, an incredibly complex topic, which I won't really dive into too much here. But, there's one quote that she has in interviews with her where she talks about that experience of foreigners coming and partaking in ceremony and her relationship to that. And she was saying that led her to say that she felt like these mushrooms, who she referred to as the saint children, had lost their purity. And so, sort of thinking about how things change over time and sort of touching back on that original, sort of conversation about like, you know, appropriation of knowledge and like how that changes over time depending who the storyteller is. You know, it just kind of like brings up something in my mind about sort of the importance of being able to like tell our stories in our own words, and you know, especially for cultures, for these women, you know, that are the keepers of fungal knowledge in their own communities, to be able to continue to have those relationships passed down and preserved over time, the way that they're meant to be. And so, you know, luckily there are a few translations of her own personal record, and she's able to, you know, advocate for her own telling of the story. But if her story wasn't recorded, you know, we may continue to have an incomplete picture of her life and the fungal wisdom that was so enmeshed with it. And I sort of wonder, with all of the, you know, participation now, and even more so like today, of people's relationships with you know, plants and mushrooms, you know, spiritually, I wonder if, you know, there's a huge part of that story that's been sort of left behind, from, you know, coming from the cultures, the women and the men who are like really stewarding those plants and mushrooms over time. And so it's just something that, you know, kind of think about, sort of, you know, what could have gotten lost along the way. And is there a way to find that knowledge again? I don't know the answer to that. So, you know, again, this kind of, you know, to kind of like jump forward to today, like now we have this sort of resurgence in, focus on, you know, plants and mushrooms with psychoactive properties as healing modalities, used to be able to treat all different kinds of physical and psychological phenomena. You know, we have got psilocybin with anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, and MDMA and ayahuasca, and there's all of these different plants and mushrooms that are sort of coming into the forefront of public consciousness again, echoing kind of where we were back in the 50s. And we actually have, you know, there's a profound amount of women that are participating in driving that research. At NYU, you know, a slew of women that are driving those studies in order to understand the relationship between psilocybin and end of life in cancer patients, and like helping to contribute to that knowledge. So like, you know, there's so many, you know, there's, can't even get into that today, but like all of the women that are like carrying forward work today. And not just women in the forefront, but also women in the underground. I was speaking with a woman who actually was working on one of those NYU studies and talking about how, you know, right now, you know, psilocybin is, you know, and these other plant medicines are going through processes to be descheduled and be available to people to be able to be used in therapeutic modalities, you know, under the, you know, prescription and, you know, through you know, close therapeutic contexts. But even while all of that's happening, there are still so many women that are working in the underground to use these medicines and to carry forward that work, and, you know, are sort of doing that like under the, you know, and so there are these women that are doing this, you know, sort of in the underground, while, you know, a lot of, you know, men, you know, are sort of the ones on the stage, like talking about these studies and really like sort of driving forward like awareness about this. You know, there is a like push towards women being at the forefront of this as well, and then also like understanding there are still women like in the underground that are moving forward this work on a personal level. And so this sort of, so we gotta wrap up in a minute, but we'll just kind of, so just to touch on, so there is a word called papoe. It is an old Algonquian term that means to swell up in stature suddenly and silently from an unseen source of power. And this is the word used to describe the mushroom, papoe. And so,
what language is that?
Algonquian. So, and so this reminds me of the strong and silent approach of some of these women. You know, the women that were working in the underground, and that unseen, almost silent force that's sort of pushing up and pushing out and sort of moving history towards where we are today, where there are so many women just like stepping forward and, you know, claiming that knowledge and really furthering that gender equality. And, you know, we know of this because of a book called Papoe for the People. which is written in 1978 by Kiwara no Kwai Peschel, on the account of Anishinabe's use of mushrooms. So this was a woman, actually because of Gordon and Valentina Wasson's quest to uncover these ethnomycological threads, she was able to form a relationship with them and be able to put together this text of her people's culture's use of mushrooms throughout time. So this is like one of, I mean, there's so few like historical texts on indigenous uses of fungi. It's like such a hunt to find like even just the faintest threads. So I feel really grateful that there is at least even one account that's able to like touch on these things. And this one book, which has undoubtedly inspired so many people, inspired one of my favorite authors, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's born in 1953 and is still alive and thriving today. She's a Potawatomi native mother, biologist, and writer. She's actually focuses on moss. She's a specialist in moss. And she writes on the scientific and indigenous ways of knowing. And in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she writes about reading about Papoe in Kiwara no Kwai's book. And this word encapsulates such an essential way of viewing nature, and it inspired her to learn her native language and preserve her language in stories for future generations. So if you haven't heard of her work or you've never read her book, I highly recommend it. It's just a phenomenal account of indigenous ways of knowing and the ways that intersects with science and art and spirit. And it's a beautiful account. But like, if this just makes me think about like why we're here today. Like, we're here to talk about women's stories, and through encapsulating these stories and telling these stories and speaking these names, we're inspiring future generations of women to continue that thread. And you know, the more that the more that these stories fall on new ears, like, the more people will become inspired and continue to create like beautiful things in the world. So, you know, again, you know, we've talked a lot about science here, and we've talked a lot about education, but I haven't even touched on art. I mean, the relationship between women and mushrooms and art is just phenomenal. I mean, especially in today's society, like, I mean, the amount of diverse artwork that's being created representing women in relationship to fungi is just like incredibly profound. And I would encourage all of you, if you're of the artistic pursuit and curious, to go out and do some research about who's creating work out there. And something that keeps, you know, that often comes up in, you know, the fungal art represented today is that there are a lot of representations of mushrooms coming out of women. So it's like these mushrooms are like emerging from women, and it just kind of, I think maybe, you know, if art is if art is a representation of culture over time, like, what does it mean to see that women represented this way? Like, are the mushrooms decomposing the women? Are they like using these women as substrates? Like, what could that relationship be? Like, are we decomposing are we decomposing aspects like of our history as women, and growing you know, new fruits from that? I feel like we are today.
The power rising from underneath.
Yeah, yeah, like taking that which has been underground and bringing it to light. And so, you know, this sort of like big picture, you know, like being connected to fungi, I sort of always ask myself, like, what could the fungi be teaching us? And I feel like in this context, like, you know, fungi, you know, are teaching us to, you know, break down the stereotypes and create new perspectives, to like decompose these old stories and to like recreate new identities, to find our work in the world, to cultivate curiosity, and discover, you know, to continue like teasing out these stories and be like bold about telling your own. And, you know, like, I feel like that's something, you know, I'm sort of speaking specifically to the women in the room, though, like, men's stories are absolutely important as well. But, like, in a world where we need to continue to be sharing those stories and, you know, really expressing, like, all of the momentum that's being happening, like, your work matters, and you're here, and it's meaningful, and you are a part of that story. I want to, like, look back from now. I mean, you know, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, like, who's the woman that's going to be doing like the mycological history of this century? Like, how many more stories are we going to have in the mix? How many more women are there? And like, who will be part of those stories, and how are we contributing to that? I feel like we're living that history now, and we have so much impact in like shaping the future for, you know, generations beyond us of you know, women in relationship to fungi. And so, you know, as we, you know, bring those narratives from the darkness and obscurity into light, and we retrace the path from where we came and discover where we want to go, we can choose to be active in creating our own stories by rekindling our own fungal knowledge, sharing our unique experience, and encouraging other women in your lives to do the same. You know, what stories are we telling ourselves, and what stories are we telling others, and what, you know, what are we taking into us, you know? And through this, you know, this time that we're in, I feel like, you know, as a culture, we're choosing to, you know, it's a complicated time. It's a complicated time for so many ways across the board right now. From the perspective, you know, the earth is hurting, and like as people we're hurting sometimes, and like things are complicated. But like, we can choose to heal. We can choose to heal the feminine in ourselves, whether we be male or female, or, you know, anything in between, you know, non-gender binary, you know, and through this healing of, you know, ourselves internally, like, we can heal our relationships and the world as well. And, you know, by taking responsibility in our healing and being committed to growth and healing, not just for now, but for future generations, we can help support like more women leaders. And so, you know, we are the voice for our families, for our community, and for the fungi, and they need us to share our gifts. And so, you know, we continue to rediscover what fungi and the inhabitants of the land have to teach us. And, you know, we continue to deepen our connection with what really moves us. And so it's kind of where I'll leave this for now. So. And again, if I had I mean, we didn't even touch on any of the women, the awesome women today that are doing work. And I feel like, again, that's a whole other, it's like a whole other phase. And I really hope that if it's not myself, it's somebody else, like, we're able to like continue to tell those stories of the women that are like really kicking ass and taking names today. And, you know, keep connecting with the ones that are, and like, you know, learning from each other and sharing those stories, and, you know, finding that connection. So thank you all for coming, and appreciate having you here. So
Thanks.
yeah.